So welcome everyone to the second floor. And our first speaker will be Vicky Iglikowski-Broad. Vicky is a principal records specialist in diverse histories at the National Archives, where she has worked since 2012. And you can view her full bio at the end of the digital programme. Vicky.
Thank you.
Thanks. Can people hear me okay? Yeah, good. So thank you so much for having me here. I feel like a bit of different take on things. We've had so many kind of wonderful talks about artistic intervention, about community collaborations, and I'm here to talk about the government archive perspective. But I think it's a really important perspective, and I hope lots of people will have resonances in the areas that they work in terms of challenges of kind of permanent collections, long-standing collections as well. So essentially this paper will look at ethical engagement with queer history with a particular focus on the government archive perspective. And this isn't just about surfacing and sharing these records, but thinking about the ethics of care. And essentially, if I can call it this, archival justice. The archive can be an important space for potentially liberatory work, seeking to address past injustices, and I think that's even possible in the government archive collections, and maybe even more important in the kind of space we work in. So the paper will ask more questions than it answers, but it's been great to think about the challenges that our collections pose and have that kind of headspace to do that, which this conference has really provided. But this is all very much a work in progress. I'd love to know what relates to collections that you work on and just have your thoughts and perspectives. So a few caveats first. It's worth noting that I'm not an archivist by profession. I'm more of a historian or a researcher. What I'm discussing is not about the ethics of what ends up in the archive so much as how we deal with the items that are already in these collections. I'm not here to discuss things like data protection related ethics. Where that's relevant, then legislation around that takes precedent. And I have used images and examples in this paper to illustrate some of the items and issues in question. But I've endeavoured to use these selectively and kind of trying to put in place some of the issues that we'll be discussing today. And I guess just a general note before we go into things that the nature of the collection means that we are discussing challenging areas, things to do with policing and historic sexuality and gender identity. So has anyone here used the National Archives at all? Or people aware of that? So I am going to just do some brief bits of context. So the UK National Archives is the archive of England and Wales and the UK government. We hold records of government departments and citizens of law. Essentially, that means that we have unique records relating to queer lives historically in our collections. So our collections chart the social and legal landscape over 1,000 years of people that we might consider to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. So these collections, very much in their nature, reflect the challenging and often problematic perspectives of past governments and indeed past societies. Unlike a lot of other collections, we don't have kind of a queer history section in our archives. Instead, the lives of LGBTQ plus people intersect with various government functions in many different ways over many different time periods, and that leads to records surviving in our collections. And that could be anything from census records to state papers to metropolitan police records. And for most of our collection's time spans, the reason we have items related to queer life is through the policing or attempted suppression of sexuality and gender identity. It's just the hard reality of the collections we hold. And that only starts to change in the last few decades of our collection, where there's a slow shift towards tolerance, respect, and equal opportunity. Within these government records, there are also significant biases and absences, and also few intersectional perspectives. And we have a very specific legislative remit under the Public Record Act, and we can't actively collect to rectify these absences or in a formal way, introduce non-government perspectives to our collections, although we can collaborate, work with others, and try and find balance in other ways. So that leaves us with a big contradiction. The policing of queer lives actually leads to rich and surprising traces of queer experiences in government collections. Within these records are occasional intimate items related to people we might now consider to be part of the queer community. And the material evidence of such relationships, such sexualities or gender identities, are often rare because preserving items was of great risk to people historically. And so that kind of means that the archive material that survives is even more important because of this kind of policing context. So we have some amazing items in our collections. And some of the surprising things you can find are brilliant expressions of agency and defiance, including people talking back to police officers. So we have some quotes from our records. One individual saying, "You don't understand our love." Another individual flirting back to police officers in the 1930s. We have expressions of powerful emotions that feel relatable and tangible despite the passage of time. Not just kind of clear-cut love and desire, but jealousy, friendship, what you might see as ghosting, all sorts of things. These again, complex, timeless, but relatable emotions that we can get from these records. We have records around space making, people carving out physical areas in space to create a sense of community, despite the significant risk. Sometimes we have information on how people self-define or self-identify, noting language use or pronouns that they use. And sometimes there's like this kind of humour and campness and lightness and a joy in the records. One series of letters use the endearing terms such as Lady of the Camellias, My Dearest Cousin Betty, and Old Auntie Annie. Although these records show incredible, powerful, and important things, these individuals ultimately never consented to being in the archive. And all these records on screen came from either police or court context. So we have things like letters, we have pamphlets with classified adverts in, we have an outfit from a particular raid on Polycarp Ballroom, and pictures of toilets from costume-related arrests. So if we go back to the quote in the title of this paper, it kind of sums up, I think, some of the challenges and opportunities of these materials. So the quote comes from a letter written by an individual called Cyril, who is partially female. And this letter was found in connection to a raid on a queer venue in the 1930s. And Cyril was traced to the Isle of Wight where this letter was found. And it's a really insightful letter and contains a unique example of someone describing their sexuality for this period, saying, "I've only been queer since I came to London about 2 years ago. Before then, I knew nothing about it. As I told you, I'm married and have a little girl, 2 years of age, and I still like girls occasionally." So not only is Cyril showing the language he used to describe himself, but also it's quite a rare declaration from this era of bisexuality or pansexuality, which is often really marginalised in the archives. His letter ends with these words, "Please be a dear boy and destroy the snow." Now, reading these words is really uncomfortable, knowing that the item survives in our collection. Yet I've also witnessed many people engaging with this letter, feeling represented and validated, seeing archival evidence of what they feel reflected from 100 years ago. I've seen people feeling profoundly connected to it. So let's pose these questions. Should we listen to Cyril's requests in his own words? Should audiences now be denied that connection and representation? Does the context change things? Cyril was writing in an era where he was forced into needing to destroy such materials. Would he celebrate and share his sexuality if he was able to now, or would he still want to be private? In doing this work, we acknowledge that we will never know. But we have to act with due care and consider all these issues that these kind of materials that Cyril's letter and many of the other types of items that are similar to this in our collections show the person who has a huge potential for engaging audiences. Some of these records have been the centre of successful past engagement activities. I just want to show a few of those briefly. So one of them was from 2017, working with the National Trust. So some individuals that have been around today and yesterday were involved in this series of work. So we worked with the National Archives, the National Trust and O'Neill Ross to recreate one of the iconic spaces in our records. This was the Caravan Club. So it's known as London's greatest boating rendezvous, the most unconventional spot of town. And this was essentially a queer haven off Shaftesbury Avenue. It was open for 6 weeks in 1934, and it was where Phil was ultimately arrested and white letters were used for evidence. We worked with immersive set designers to create an atmosphere inspired by the images in our collection. So this black and white photograph is from our records, it's from police records, police-related records, Department of Public Prosecution. But as far as I'm aware, the photographs we have of the Caravan Club are the only ones that survive. We then have a recreation of that, obviously interpreting what the kind of colours might have looked like and recreating the kind of fabric feel to the space. We then also use that recreated venue for tours of Soho's queer spaces past and present. And in the evening, the venue reopened as the Caravan Society for nights of queer cabaret and balls, much like it would have been at the time. It was a really powerful and moving project to be part of, reclaiming a space that had once been closed down, bringing it to life again, cultivating queer joy there, and also having a really important conversation around the closure of queer venues, which was helpful then in the 1930s, topical in 2017, and obviously still very prevalent as well. The significance and spirit of the project is captured in some of the feedback by one individual who said, for those few nights the comet blazed across Soho, and all of us had a place where we could be glorious together and set the world on fire. We had the Caravan Society. So that is one example. And then just briefly, another example. This one is based on work we did in 2019 on classified adverts from the 1920s. And we used these adverts to engage audiences through the Being Human Festival. So the item that was the centre of this work was the Link, which was a small publication that described itself as non-matrimonial. And it was a lonely arts kind of publication, sort of classified adverts, not just the back pages, but the whole kind of content. And essentially, people would use it to find same-sex connections. There was used coded clear language, and people had up to 25 words to describe themselves and their interests. So when I came across it, it was kind of like a 1920s winder. It felt very relatable to modern audiences. And so people would use phrases like unconventional, artistic, bohemian, lonely, jolly, sporty, literary, to kind of signify their interest, because it's the 1920s and people couldn't be completely open, but they wanted to still create ways to reach out to each other. So we worked with drag artist Timberlina to perform these adverts, and we also worked with the Bishopsgate Institute archives to kind of tell a further story of classified adverts and how the language had changed. And the final event was at the RMT. So audiences wrote their own coded classified adverts too, enabling participants to closely engage with the archive and kind of to relate it to themselves and their own experiences. So these are just two examples of the potential of these records. I think with any engagement, it's worth thinking about how much the specific context of an item makes a difference to the ethics of how we use it. So does the passage of time make a difference? One of the bundles of letters on screen is from 1927. And another one, the word campus share, is from 1868. How does that change what feels appropriate? Classified adverts, are these different in terms of engagement because they're essentially anonymous? Does that change the dynamic? And again, we have an example from the 1920s and then an example from the late 1960s. That's related to the International Times at the top, and that's a project I'm hoping to get into soon. So essentially, how does that dynamic change things? Are photographs of empty spaces different from photographs of people? I chose not to share photographs with individuals in today. We only have a few examples in the archives, but the ones that exist, the The people in them don't look ashamed, they look defiant. But it's still a question of whether that's right or not to share. And some of these records have already been pretty widely shared in academic publications or other spaces. So, I mean, the wonderful work of that whole book has underpinned a lot of the kind of items, the work and the research that I've been talking about today. And he was saying the other day that Queer London is almost 20 years old, his publication. So, you know, there's been a long time that some of those have been part of kind of at least academic discourse and field as well. So before I draw some conclusions, it is worth noting that I'm sharing a particular type of subset of records that tend to reflect these real personal versus state complexity. In other contexts, there are also queer people crying out to be heard and demanding that the government listen and act in their interests. So it's important to recognise that these voices exist too, but the context allows them to be open. So this particular record is from 1991, where a campaigner asks and writes into the government, can we be counted too, in relation to the lack of data recording LGBTQ+ lives on the census. So the archival draws from different periods offer a point of contrast and a point of reflection about how LGBTQ+ people can be heard in different ways in different periods, and the lack of choice some individuals have about what narrative made it into the archive and whether they could be open. So to draw some kind of concluding points, I guess, based on all of the above, I want to try and pull together some thoughts. Clearly, there are some really important ethical considerations that I want to tentatively suggest some very imperfect ways of working through these issues so that we can respect the individuals in our records, sensitively do justice to their life stories, and try, where possible and appropriate, to still use these records to engage audiences. And actually, the words of Sean Curran yesterday stood out to me and felt like a bit of a provocation. Don't let perfection stand in the way of actions. And I think with these records, the risk of being imperfect in the work that we do could mean we never use these records, but they are really important. And so I guess I would raise that the provocation for you all to think about and maybe challenge me on whether that is the right or wrong approach. So considerations for using such records, some of the things I've drawn together. That's really important to accurately contextualise records. In trying to reclaim the personal, it's important not to divorce items from their context. Acknowledging and affirming what people went through historically. Increasingly, I'm kind of seeing our collections almost in part of archives or homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, queerphobia. And that's really challenging and difficult, but it doesn't make the collections any less important. And they are important because they show the lived reality that people faced historically. Time and considered use. These records need thought and consideration in their use. This requires appropriate time and resourcing. It's not the kind of work that can be rushed. So maybe there's kind of some internal advocacy that some of us need to do in our organisations to make sure that time is appropriately effective. Individual context, as I kind of mentioned, each record should be treated individually and assessed for appropriateness in a specific context, thinking about boundaries of what is and isn't ethical in specific uses. And something like social media particularly comes to mind as an area that would be really problematic with some of these records because things can be taken so out of context and there isn't enough space often to do justice to the sensitivity. Records should be used in a way that has compassion and respect for those in the archives. And how can we frame things to recognise people as individuals that really live? Whether that's thinking about whether names should be used or anonymised, or should images with people be used. I think we need space for complexity to be surfaced and discussed, particularly when we're engaging with people. Used in context that gives space for wider discussions and reflections. Allowing these difficult and critical contexts to be raised, for channel and balance in the archive to be confronted and challenged. And again, that needs time to do that. So using these items in spaces where there is enough time to really work with audiences in sensitive ways. Processing collections are complex and imperfect, and kind of trying to acknowledge that. It's okay to feel challenged by the archive, to feel angry at the archive, to sit with the discomfort of it. But it's kind of, as heritage professionals, part of our responsibility to also try and find ways to support people and help them process these tough records. Maybe we think about workshop formats when we engage people, wellbeing facilitators or creative practitioners. And then also acknowledging the multiplicity of items and the duality within them. It's possible to read items on multiple levels and against the grain of why they were originally created. Indeed, we do that all the time at the National Archives, given the context of our collections. And trauma and joy are both held within many items we have. And it's important to acknowledge that both are relevant for this history. We have a responsibility as custodians of these public records to share them with communities who have a personal investment in these histories and to do it in appropriate and sensitive ways. And this is about meaningful engagement, not numbers or targets, putting the ethics of care for historical figures and current audiences at the heart of the choices we make. I've worked at the National Archives for over 10 years now, and it does feel like ethical considerations rightly have a lot more weight and a big part of the conversations we should be having. I'm sure, like many of you working with queer history records, I feel a great responsibility working with these items. I feel quite vulnerable sharing these reflections with you because it's an acknowledgement that I'm not sure we've always got it right in the past, but that we're working to do better. So these are the kind of imperfect work in progress thoughts, kind of simple ideas, but maybe principles to kind of ground some of what we do when things get busy and it can be easy to get tied up in other parts of the record. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, which is really fair.
Thank you very much, Vicky, for that talk. Our second speaker, who will be speaking to us online, is Caio de Araujo, who is a curatorial fellow at the University of the Western Cape and a research officer at the Other Foundation. Since 2019, he's been a collaborator of the Ghana Queer Archive based in South Africa and has led queer research, documentary and heritage curatorial projects in South Africa, Angola and Mozambique. And you can view his full bio and make sure it's online.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for opening this space. It's really exciting to be here. For me, it's a little bit of a new experience in the sense that even if I have been working with archives and with queer archives for a very long time, I think this is the first conference that I've attended where I perhaps can say that the majority of participants are actually quote unquote proper archival practitioners. So this is quite interesting to occupy this space. So something of part of my presentation is precisely to reflect on who are the memory workers working with different kinds of memory initiatives. In Southern Africa, the boundaries are really blurred. There's a lot of activist archiving going on. There's a lot of, debates involving intellectuals, academics, of course, but also all sorts of cultural practitioners in a very broad sense. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that today. So the title of the talk, as you can see here, is Archival Assemblages, Queering African Pasts Through Archival Interventions. Can you still hear me? I'm a little bit conscious of the fact that I couldn't be heard before. Okay, great. Yes. If there is any interruption in terms of the sound, please let me know. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to give a very quick background because I'm also mindful of the fact that a significant part of the audience may not be necessarily familiar with what is the context in Southern Africa. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a background on where this work is coming from. So as many of you may know, in this particular sense, Southern Africa is not necessarily different from other areas of the world where HIV/AIDS health policy was a major driving force behind the institutionalization of LGBTI activism. In a way that is still the case, we do have a lot of funding being pumped into LGBTI activism from the HIV/AIDS sector. However, even if that remains the case, there has been a shift in the last decade or so in the donor landscape, but also in it's a community-led shift away from HIV to a much broader understanding of LGBTI activism and of health. That includes the emergence of well-being as a priority, which tends to single out mental health and other sorts of well-being as a policy gap. For instance, economic empowerment is another huge area, and you will I promise that you will understand why this is connected to archiving in a minute. As many of you will be familiar, in archival theory, there is a quite already widely explored relationship between archiving, trauma, injury, and mourning, which connects to the issue of well-being that I was speaking about. And Zvetkovich's book, An-Archival Feelings, has been quite instrumental in bringing up this debate. And one of the arguments that has been quite influential is the idea that queer healing is a practice that engages trauma rather than refusing it, rather than rejecting it. In the book and in a lot of the work that has been done around the idea of an archive of feelings, we can see that, imaginative performative work, including in the arts, has been quite taken up as a form of engaging trauma in a creative manner rather than narrativizing it around the idea of the traumatic event. And this is something that I will show has been emerging quite critically in archival initiatives in this part of the world. So another contextual, quick contextual thinking that I wanted to bring about is the idea of the very rise of the queer archive and queer libraries as an act of survival and remembrance as well. There's a lot of research has been invested into thinking, what does it mean about queer archival? What does it mean to think about queer archival practice when those practices have been devised in the midst of a global epidemic, precisely HIV/AIDS. So there is this idea that the archival drive in queer activism has been quite a direct response to the experience of death and the experience of annihilation. Precisely because people are dying, we need to remember. And we need to remember how all those processes are happening. That has been a little bit of how those the proliferation of queer archives through activism have happened in especially in North America and Europe. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in my own work is trying to understand why we now have a proliferation of queer archives in the Global South as well, which is a process that has happened a lot in the last 10 years. So, beyond the kind of HIV/AIDS framework. So that's something that interests me a lot. However, because of this, of the weight that HIV/AIDS have had as a generative force for queer archiving in the global north, what we have seen to this day is a very striking and uneven distribution of queer archives in the world. So this is a map that is outdated. It's the only map that I could find online. It's from the late 80s. I am now trying to compile my own map, but for the sake of the point I'm showing this, it's no longer accurate in the sense that a lot of queer archives now exist in the Global South. But here you can see the north-south distribution of gay and lesbian archives and libraries in the late 80s. I mean, today, I think you would still see an overrepresentation of the Global North with a lot of other marks in the Global South. Part of it has to do with funding. There is a coloniality of contemporary archival funding. It's extremely rare for queer archives in the Global South to have access to the kinds of state funding that, heritage institutions in Global North countries are able to provide, which is a huge problem that, as someone working with these archives, we are constantly thinking about. There is no comparison in the kinds of funding that could be unlocked from small grants from the development or the human rights sector and the kinds of funding that are coming through, let's say, European heritage institutions. So this is something that I think we should keep at the back of our heads. Of course, many queer archives in the Global North, they are expensive in the sense that they very actively are curating and documenting histories that are in a way challenging the North-South divide. For instance, collections on migrant communities, on people of color, on queer communities of color in Europe or North America. But then that also brings the question that connectivity to Europe or North America becomes the entry ticket into those collections, right? One needs to be a migrant. One needs to be a minority population in a European country to then be included in those collections. Everything that I'm saying, it's very broad strokes. Obviously, there are specificities that one can think about in particular collections that are doing the work otherwise. So part of where I'm coming from, as I was saying, I'm trying to think about what is causing the contemporary boom on queer archiving in the Global South. And here there are a few examples of archives that they're all relatively new. Some of them are from the 2010s. Some of them have been literally being set up in the last 5 years. So we have Argentina, Brazil, India, trans and intersex archive that is Africa-wide, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. Those are examples of archives that I know and that I have used, but obviously, there's so many more. So I think that there is something in the air that could explain why all those initiatives are popping up recently, and that is something that I have been trying to think about. So something that I find quite interesting about, and that is perhaps common around all these initiatives, is that they really pose a question of what happens to an archive when it works besides itself. So those are not necessarily archives in a strict sense, or what people would conventionally call an archive. Rather, I'm trying to work with the idea of archival realness as a concept that we can take from queer theory as something that imitates, and by imitating is questioning the ontology of that which it is imitating. It's questioning the realness of that which it is imitating. And I think these archives, by claiming to be archives, by claiming the idea of an archive, but then practicing documentation and public engagement in many different ways, they are also questioning the very notion of what an archive is. and one way in which they're doing that, and I'm gonna give you a couple of examples in a minute, is by resorting to archival assemblages. So having a very, very broad understanding of what can go into an archive, also challenging the limitations of the narrative form. So there's a lot of work that is being done that it is very much beyond the written form or even the narrative form, in terms of orality. There is a resort to photography as a queer method, so bringing in the visual element quite strongly. And lastly, I'm also trying to think about how are different funding structures shaping what is possible for queer archives in the Global South. So something that is quite important to think about is that the majority of the funding that is going to these archival projects, they are not coming from state or heritage institutions or forms of funding. They are coming from the development sector, from the human rights sector, from the LGBTI funding sector. And I think that shapes the work that is being done in particular ways that we need to be considerate of. So this is one of the initiatives that I've been working with quite closely. It's an online archive on trans and intersex history in Africa. It's supposed to cover the entire continent, and it's really activist-led archive in the sense that it intends to document not only histories of trans and intersex people, but also of trans and intersex organizing. So it really relies on donations from trans and intersex movements from across the continent to voluntarily submit information about their organizations, their important moments, etc., etc. So it's a project that I think it's really fascinating in the ways they're going about documentation and transnational collaboration as well. However, the archive that I have been collaborating with for the longest time is the Gala Queer Archive, which is based here in Johannesburg, where I am based. It is the oldest queer archive in the African continent. It was founded in the late 90s, so it has existed for over 20 years. It is an archive in a conventional sense, in the sense that it has an office, it has a collection, it has a repository, it has, an inventory, it has finding aids and all of that stuff. And it is the only archive constituted as such in a conventional sense in the African continent. It does have a mandate that expands beyond South Africa, and that's where I have been collaborating with them quite closely in leading documentary archival projects outside of South Africa, especially in Lusophone Africa, in Mozambique and Angola. And I'm going to speak about two projects as case studies to the kinds of dynamics that I'm talking about. So something interesting about Gala is that for some time they have worked on a voluntary basis as well. They were also relying on donations from queer individuals in South Africa. However, that basically meant that when you rely on donations, you introduce racial and class bias into the collections, because in the ways in which self-archiving works, middle class, white, queer, cisgender people are the most likely to actually have an archive about their lives that then they donate. So partially as a response to that, Gala has been devising several projects where instead of waiting for people to donate materials, they actually go out into the world and actively collect. And I have been involved in two of those projects. The first of them, it was a project on creating a queer collection for Mozambique, mostly based on oral histories. And it was called Archives of the Intimate Queer Oral Histories of Maputo. So a lot of the work was done in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, in partnership with Lambda, which is a civil society organization based in Mozambique. So part of what we did is actually going about collecting, print material from the movements that had been produced by the LGBTI movement across time since the early 2000s. We also went into the colonial archives and tried to find records of LGBTI people from the colonial Mozambican press. These are press clippings reporting on gender non-conforming people in the 60s from Mozambican newspapers. Mozambique was a settler colonial society, so it had quite it was a site of a lot of circulation, especially inside the Lusophone world. So the news clip that you see on the right is of a Brazilian cross-dressing performer that had a residency in Mozambique in the early 1970s. And in the newspaper, she's talking about doing sexual reassignment surgery to become a woman. So part of this work was done in very close collaboration with civil society organizations, many of which already have departments for documentation. And this is a quote from the activist who led the documentation department at the civil society organization we collaborated with. So he says, LGBT people's lives are somehow invisible. Because they are invisible, there is a need to build a narrative about these lives that are often marginalized. The documentation of life histories has, above all, the potential of drawing attention to those who have rights, so these people do not suffer with discrimination in the future. So really, what I think this work is showing, and working with these organizations has made it quite clear to me, is that the labor of queer archiving that these organizations are doing is not so much a labor of remembering the past, but one of claiming the future. And I think this is what this quote shows quite strongly. So I think I'm going to try to conclude soon. I don't think I'll have the time to go through the Angola project. So I'm just going to say a few more words about the Mozambique project, which goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning. As the project was ongoing, we really felt that the conventional, the kind of narrative form imposed a limitation. So especially written text, as I was saying, a lot of the work was being based on written text from the press, from pamphlets, all the kinds of materials that we are familiar with. And then even oral histories, right? So interviews that were then transcribed and, transformed into text. So that was a problem, especially from the oral history point of view, because people, narratives of the self is not everyone's cup of tea. Some people are a lot more inclined to narrativize their own lives into speech than others. And that was starting to include a bias in the work that we were doing, in the sense that there were other people that also wanted to be included in the project, but they were just not good at giving oral history interviews, right? So how do you go around that, around those issues? So part of what we decided to do is to include a photographic element in the project. And we did a photo book that combined both the narratives, the life histories, the testimonies, and basically a bunch of images. And we did like several photo sessions with people who were part of the archival project in a way or another, and that was such a cool part of the project, really. And then we went back with the photographs to the people and asked them to say a few words about, what that meant to them in terms of their own lives. I mean, what meant to be included in the collection in that way. So here's some of the quotes. I won't really have time to go to a lot of the other projects. I want to conclude. So something that the work that a lot of these organizations are doing, and I have worked more closely with Mozambique and Angola, is that the promise of the archive is not so much one of intellectual curiosity, although intellectual curiosity is there. People are curious to learn about their past, and they are, curious to queer history in a way. But what I think, the archive as a practice and as an institution information, a lot of these archives are still in the process of becoming, is the ways that they can be used in speculation to as a site from which we can produce all these forms of critical fabulation. So they really work beyond a documentary mode and more in terms of remembering the future. So remembering the future beyond death and annihilation, but really, creating the space in which the future can be claimed, even if, as a very, imaginative possibility. And I think this is part of the appeal of those archival projects, and this is why they are so cool, really. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
So much for that incredibly thought-provoking talk. Now our final speaker is Ian Parry, who is a transdisciplinary artist, theatre designer and researcher. They recently completed a PhD at the University of Brighton, investigating battling queer stream this.
In Asexual Resonances, Tracing a Queerly Asexual Archive, Isabello and Cooper discuss, quotes, the possibility of assembling a creative and queer archive consisting, following Jose Munoz, of resonances, moments, touches, or textures. To archive a moment, they propose, is to archive a feeling, an instance, a trace, a resonance. A moment is always historical, of the past, but also of the present. It is tangled somewhere within us in the personal archive that we carry. This analysis of moments especially implicates the body and the feeling subject, historicising them whilst smearing their temporal fixity. It also, I suggest, points towards subjectivity and positionality as a kind of historiography in themselves, expanding on what Margaret Middleton refers to as queer experience as expertise and gaydar as epistemology, one of my favourite history quotes, and Caio, asserting the value of trans gaze in historical research, argues that trans people can pick up on hints and signals in the historical records that others might overlook. This community recognition also provides an ethical alternative to subjecting historical figures to the same kind of diagnostic processes that trans people have to go through in the present day to prove our realness. Crucially, attending to resonances is not a one-directional activity. Rather, it's a noticing or inviting of an echo, something which resonates with or within us. Yes, brilliant. I have never used one of these little pepper things before. It's quite powerful. Historian, author, and Black Studies scholar. Oh, wrong slide. No, right side. Historian, author, and Black Studies scholar Sadiya Hartman coined the term critical fabulation to describe a radically creative approach to the gaps, erasures, and oppressive framings of the archive. Hartman speaks of, quote, amplified moments of withholding, escape, and possibility, saying, it required me to speculate, listen intently, read between the lines, attend to the disorder and mess of the archive, and to honour silence. She also says, I wanted to topple the hierarchies that determine how we know things and who people are in the world. So in preparing for this talk about the Queer History Club's engagement with the archives of the National Maritime Museum, I've been delving into another very particular kind of archive, our Greek WhatsApp chat. Since autumn 2022, I've been involved in a community research project at the National Maritime Museum, initially as a facilitator alongside my colleague and friend S. Grange, and more recently as a participant as the group has evolved to become something more collaboratively self-facilitated. So the initial brief was very open, a research project that explored the archives and collections through a queer lens. My own and S's practice involves the exploration of history through creative practice. So that was a perspective that we were bringing, but the invitation of the group was to explore the collections in whatever ways excited them, resonated with their practice, or just felt right. We had a mixture of participants from various backgrounds, practices, and levels of prior experience doing historical research. To date, outcomes of this project have included zines, workshops, performances, artworks, stories, maps, alternative tours, oak gall ink making, a camp homage to Nelson's funeral, a symposium, outrage in the right-wing press, and a subtle ongoing integration of the group's work into the museum's wider ecology. I'm primarily interested here, though, not in defining a project in terms of these kinds of more tangible outcomes, but in something more intangible and unquantifiable. I'm interested in vibes. I want to foreground the aspects of the project that might seem peripheral, that don't fall within the scope of orthodox knowledge production or academic research. I'm interested in a conversation between ourselves and with the objects, the directives and the ghosts of the museum. I'm interested in feelings, grief, rage, mirth, horniness. The feeling of having a queer research buddy to go to the library with, how the atmosphere of that room subtly shifts when you enter, becomes a different kind of space, a queerer kind of space. Having a group to share your latest findings with, like hot gossip, intermingled with research advice, recipes, ethics debates, outfit advice, links, sewing patterns, emotional support, crafting tips, photos and memes. Lots of memes. So I'm arguing here for Queer History Club as a creative project for collaborative knowledge building, a shared endeavour of critical fabulation, a kind of archive of feelings, and the group WhatsApp as not simply an archive, but a manifestation of that. But the archives and collections of the National Maritime Museum encompass a specialist library with both original documents and specialist secondary material and publications, and an extensive and diverse collection of objects relating to maritime history, with a focus on the British Navy, and a lot of stuff relating to Nelson, including a look of his hair, multiple depictions in pottery of him swooning in pink breeches supported by his two boyfriends, and the clothes that he died in. Small things. So I think it's not unfair to characterise the entire founding premise of the Maritime Museum as an act of fandom and a big crush on the Navy and Nelson. And yeah, it's like we. I also want to say crushing and fandom are spaces of queerness, and I think that's an interesting starting point to explore the collection. The Navy has acknowledged a long-standing status within queer culture and history as a homosocial and a homosexual space. So although the museum and its collections tend to be read as a very straight space and a primarily very masculine space, I would argue there's lots about the museum that's already intrinsically very queer and ripe for further. That said, the organisation of the collections and how they have traditionally been framed means that queerness is, queerness, little Freudian slip there, it's very rarely visible and it's difficult to search for directly. So instead, our invitation to the group was to cruise the collections and to notice what flirted with them. And I think that kind of allowance and even foregrounding of historical crushes and fandom and effective responses alongside more traditional research has kind of really become a space of allowance, and by acknowledging those, you can ask what happens when you sort of lean into that as a perspective, and what kind of insights it produces, and what sort of perspective shifts can emerge. My life at time. Okay. So I want to talk about some specific projects. This is the work of one of the researchers, Jazz Bevan-Nitz. They came into the project and with no particular interest in Nelson until they saw a very cute picture of him, which is now referred to in the group. Did a ghost just come into the space? Yeah. Wow. Cool. Welcome Nelson. Which we now refer to as Twink Nelson. I'll just say Twinkle there. I'm really enjoying the sort of queering that's happening in this text space as well. And so Jazz did some really interesting research in the archives and found this extraordinary letter where some French count invites Nelson to come to France and says there are some very pretty little midshipmen who will teach you French in a manner that you will find most pleasing. Interpret as you like. And Nelson did decline on that occasion. That seemed quite generally open to the suggestion. Jazz now has a role within the museum. They work there as a front of house guide, and she leads a tour, a talk called Nelson and the Men Who Loved Him. But I think this for me is a triumph. This is I don't even know what to call it, but basically incredibly sort of rich historical, LARPing project. A sort of performance of Nelson's funeral called #NelsonFest. I think it's and again let's see. And it was a really interesting event, but I think really sort of invited an interest in kind of reframing of the original event as a deeply, deeply camp affair. So this is one of the things that Jazz spoke about at the symposium we held about 9 months into the project. It was a slow news week in the right-wing gutter press. I think their Tory overlords had encouraged them to dig up some dirt to distract. I think that's like the week that the election was called, or something. Like they were desperate for a distraction. And so, yeah, a lot of people got very excited and frothy over this, and it's first the immortal line in David Herrick by Lord, I don't think we had who Lord somebody here. There were two people quoting that article, they were both lords. One of them said, Admiral Nelson's heterosexuality was so vigorous as to be a subject of intense discussion amongst everybody in the year. I'll just leave that with you. Yeah, so the museum responded in quite a museum-y way, broadly supportive of the project and, you know, sort of critiquing the misinformation in the article and then the further response articles. But it also took down some of the more overtly queer material from the event page, along with some mentions of critiquing colonial histories. It anonymised the contributors, obviously an act of protection, but you know, also an act of erasure. And generally there was a sort of calming, downplaying, framing it as creative and playful responses to the Nelson archive, whilst seemingly striving to reassure the public that nobody at all was suggesting that there was anything queer about Nelson. Yeah, in the context of what is going on politically and the pressures that public bodies are under, this is a predictable response. But yeah, I just want to take a little bit of time to, not much because we're running up, but to imagine what if the museum felt able to say, what if somebody is exploring the possible queerness of Nelson? What is at stake here? What are the investments in straight, in quotes, Nelson? Why should contemporary constructions of straightness be assumed or imposed any more than queerness? Lord Thingy said, it's bad history. The men who loved him did so because he was quintessentially a military leader, not because they fancied him. Actual quote from a lord. So yeah, all of them, Lord Roberts. What good historical evidence does Lord Roberts have for the emotional lives of thousands of people who lived and died over 200 years ago? We actually do have first-hand eyewitness accounts, famously, of Nelson's final words, asking his friends to kiss him, and nobody having a problem with that at the time. And of his openly being in a throuple, which brings me on to the next project, which I think I'm going to have to race through quite quickly, but the person who made it is sitting over there at the back, and probably Mike might talk to you about it later in conversation, if he has an answer. This is a really beautiful performance project inspired by the Hammer Nelson throuple. And it's very much kind of built on sort of resonance between the artist and Emma Hamilton. There's numerous resonances between his and Emma's lives, and from that starting point, Caio has created these really interesting performances that incorporate life modelling and singing and sort of subversion of the sort of patriarchal and cis-normative gaze that's surrounded. And the final project, really fun. I could talk about this week, but there are other longer. This is some research that one of our group, Emma Sala, did into a sailor and assigned female Earth person who sailed on numerous ships under at least two different names, and lived at the line. And Emma did some incredible research in maritime archives, in archives in Palermo, where Emma's from, and where William had spent some time, and in some North American archives. Yeah, I'm also really interested in the sort of the journey that we all went on with Emma, and the sort of the adventure of that, and the sort of the quite upsetting and unexpected turn this took when Emma managed to trace him to Bombay, where he got married a month after being outed on a year later, and then disappeared from those rails. And it was really emotional for all of us. Like, we'd all become so invested in William, and there was real grief and mourning in the group, but also this outpouring of imagination around possible interpretations of William's story, and yeah, filling in the gaps in that archive, in collaborative and imaginative and loving and playful ways. Yeah, I am drawing to some sort of conclusion. Really, I want to foreground the sort of the love and the care that exists within this group, and to really put a spotlight on the sort of backstage labour that goes into any historical project, and the sort of excitement and investment and gossip and mutual caretaking that goes on and often doesn't sort of get surfaced. To return just very briefly to some fucking Tory, we managed to somehow say something really true in the middle of his stratum. So I just want to give some love and thanks to the Queer History Club founding members: Linnea Martins, Phil Mikulski, Rose Power, Jazz Bevan-Niss, Emma Sala, Caio Harper, S. Grange, Billy Douche Juniors, and our Queen Charlotte. Thank you.